Multiple things can be true at once. The map is not the territory. Not all maps represent the same territory, much less in the same way, but the territory exists, and the right map is a useful guide to understanding and navigating the territory. This topic, the map-territory distinction, is something I've wanted to talk about for a while, and I think I finally have an approach I'm happy with. So I want to start with Jorge Borges and the one-paragraph short story on exactitude in science, which I thought about reading, but I think it's easier just to paraphrase, even though it's one paragraph, which basically there is this kingdom that has a group of cartographers make a map that covers every detail in the territory at a one-to-one scale. And of course, that map is useless, and so it ends up being abandoned and torn up in tatters in the desert, which gets to a critical point, which is that for a map to be useful, it needs to be reductionist. It needs to leave a lot out, sort of on the Pareto principle, 80-20. 80% of anything is accounted for by 20% of inputs, roughly. And there's other numbers, different ways. But the general point remains that for whatever you're trying to do, most of the information that you need can be conveyed in a small number of factors. And so we all use maps all the time, often not necessarily aware that we're using maps. And that actually gets me into Jean Baudrillard in Simulation and Simulacra, which, so he talks about, in his case, there are, I think, 4 levels of simulacra. But what really matters here is he acknowledges reality exists, and then first-order simulacra is a representation of reality, so it's a map. But we also use maps and maps and maps and maps and such until we lose track of them, potentially, which is, I think, because there are layers to reality, and there's at least 2 that I think are critical to understand, which are the default underlying physical reality and social reality, which this book, a while ago, I read the introduction and first chapter, which I do a lot nonfiction books. And then I finally started reading it, got about halfway through and decided I'm done with philosophy for a while, so I'm going to finish it when I feel like I'm into philosophy again. But Searle is pointing out that, for example, property ownership and money are social realities that cannot exist without language and sort of people acknowledging them as such, and sort of builds on that premise. He also notes that his last chapter, he is making the case that there is also an underlying reality because people doubt that. And so I think that point is kind of critical to understanding our social reality. Often the map kind of is the territory, right? Like with currency. And even when it's not, it contains maps of both physical, like underlying reality, and of itself, sort of self-referentially, right? Social reality contains maps of social reality. And again, map is not the territory is a metaphor, right? But I think it's a useful metaphor. And so think about subway maps versus those tourist maps that you'll get in cities that have like the hotspots and local businesses versus a highway map versus a UGS, United States Geographic Service topographical map, right? All of those serve different functions for different purposes. And if you're using a UGS topographical map to try to navigate around the subways in Manhattan, you're going to probably get horribly lost, right? But if you're using a subway map to try to drive around Manhattan, you're also going to get lost. And so it depends what you're trying to do. And this is true. If you haven't seen my video on frameworks, I'd suggest watching it after this, because ultimately these maps, they're just frameworks that are helping us reduce the critical components of some form of reality, whether it's physical reality or social reality, down to the essential parts that we need to navigate it. And so I have mentioned before that I didn't think I identified with a philosophical school until I started reading the Pragmatists, and this is William James' Pragmatism. And I realized I think I can call myself a pragmatist, which makes sense because it both stems from American culture and permeates it. And James' point is essentially, you don't need to know what's precisely true. You just need to compare the various frameworks, the various maps you have, and ask which one is going to make the more useful predictions for me and follow that in those circumstances. And that, I think, is the essential point. And with all that in mind, I actually wanted to now sort of come back to something I discussed in one of my earlier videos, which is the book, Spiral Dynamics, which, if you've heard of this, it's almost certainly people talking about Ken Wilber's sort of reinterpretation. And so Ken Wilber's representation of spiral dynamics is a good example of what Baudrillard would call second-order simulacra, because it is a representation of simplification of spiral dynamics, which is a simplification of reality. And Wilbur does this because he is then building on it. And so you can see this is a pretty decent sized book, and they've written papers and stuff beyond it, and it still doesn't cover everything you might want to know about it. So to actually build on it into his integral theory, he had to take a lot out. And in that video, I talked about a couple of things he took out. For this video, I'm just going to mention, so it's critical to understand there are a lot of like developmental levels theories for both people and societies that operate in various different ways. One of the most common is that we have, especially with morality, you have pre-conventional morality, conventional morality, and post-conventional morality. So pre-conventional morality would be you don't lie because you'll get punished for lying. Conventional morality would be you don't lie because lying is wrong, and we agree that it's wrong. Post-conventional morality is we don't lie because lying is harmful or such and such a reason, right? Or it might be, no, actually we do lie. Actually, lying is better potentially, depending on who you're talking to. So that's, I think, the easiest to understand. But I still want to talk about spiral dynamics because it breaks down at a more granular level of detail that I think is more useful for this discussion. And it also gets to something I think is important, which is that spiral dynamics has a distinction between first order and second order thinking. So everything from beige, purple, red, blue, orange, green, up to this is first order, and then yellow, turquoise, and coral is second order. And until you've reached second order thinking, if you acknowledge that spiral dynamics exists, most people at first order thinking think they're doing second order thinking when they're not. And then when you actually get there, you're like, oh, this is second order thinking. And in my case, I had already gotten to second order thinking before my father told me about Wilbur's interpretation. The other thing that is important about spiral dynamics that I think is helpful is that the warm colors represent agency-motivated goals, sort of you're trying to achieve as an individual in the world. And cool colors represent communion-motivated goals. You're trying to connect with other people and build society. And that's, I think, one of the most important things that Wilbur left out in his simplification of spiral dynamics. And so I wanted to bring it up again because, so I tried to, this was a tower snail shell that I sort of drew from memory. So I looked it up after, and I'm like, I didn't quite get it right, what these snails look like, but it's close. And so you can see I have, the colors, so beige, purple, red, blue, orange, green, yellow, turquoise, coral, and I have this one as like indigo or violet. In my video on the book, I mentioned I was not entirely sure if coral exists. And suppose I should explain, if you're not familiar with spiral dynamics, what these colors are very briefly. And so beige is basically survival, purple is kind of magical thinking, red is how do I get what I want out of the world? Blue is sort of the conventional sort of morality-based, rules-based order. Orange is sort of the rationalistic, empirical order. And then green is the post-rationalistic, people often say that associate green with postmodernism, though not everyone who is green is a postmodernist, and not all postmodernists are green. Like Baudrillard is generally associated with postmodernism, but his writing is at least yellow, I would say. But still, this gives you a general idea. And then the second order levels, like you can see if you're at the first order. I think if someone explains it to you, you can at least see what the higher levels look like. Second order is hard to understand until you are there. And it's interesting because it's one thing you'll see is we all have different personalities and like inclinations, right? And so I've always inclined towards perspectivism. And people who incline towards perspectivism will often seem like they're second order when they're not. And I actually know there's a channel on YouTube who I watch, and I was wondering, is he yellow or is he really good orange? And I actually sent him an email, and his answers, I'm like, okay, yeah, he's orange, but he's really good at it. However, anyway, so the reason I am going over these sort of spiral dynamics, and I mentioned in my last video coral, I wasn't sure if it existed, because once you have second order and you have it for both agency and communion goals, do you need more? And the authors of spiral dynamics said they thought like the second order thinking didn't arise until recently. But if you read like Taoist texts, I think you pretty clearly see yellow and turquoise thinking in them. And with coral, so when I read this book, Al-Ghazali's Path to Sufism, he sort of takes turquoise for granted and then yes-ands it, seemingly. which suggests something beyond turquoise thinking, assuming, and again, this is a map, but it's a map of sort of development that is assuming we all develop on a certain trajectory in Western societies. And so Al-Ghazali, who was in the Islamic world before modernism even existed in the West, it could be there's different developments in different parts of the world as well. I won't get into all that here. And then for the existentialist philosophy reading group I attend, we read Nietzsche, Human, All Too Human. And I was talking to a friend who is familiar with Nietzsche and familiar with Ken Wilber's interpretation of spiral dynamics, though I've told her about sort of the critical features of the original that Wilber left out, at least to my mind. And I was describing Nietzsche in this book and saying, this seems like, again, he is assuming turquoise and then yes-anding it. And my friend was like, yeah, Nietzsche at the end of his life, I'm very convinced, was coral. So I was not sure if coral existed or what it looked like. And I think I'm getting there now, and I think it's becoming clearer that coral is the distinction between coral versus yellow and turquoise, at least in the West, is that it comes back to sort of recognizing both the impossibility of individualism and the necessity of hierarchies, which I talked about. I finally started questioning my assumptions in terms of individualism and egalitarianism recently, though I'd sort of been grasping at this for a while. And then, so you often see what my friend calls harmonics between these. And so you see, the office predicted you see a harmonic with red. And so red is like, how do you manipulate people sort of for my own ends? And then coral becomes, how do we interact with society for what I think the best ends are, which is, sounds like social engineering, which I've been critical of, but it's not, because again, I'm talking about like on a grassroots, like community-based, voluntary level. But anyways, so the reason I am going over all of this is because I've been thinking about, this is sort of a good way to illustrate how map territory distinctions and their understandings differ. And the reason sort of brought it all together is I mentioned, I've been trying to understand a number of things, one of which is sort of right-wing thought. And I watched a new right-wing YouTube channel, so I'm not going to link the video because it wasn't very interesting, except that they said something that a lot of people who identify with the right like to claim, which is that the right is interested in truth and recognizes an underlying reality and is trying to get there, and the left rejects it. And there are, Thomas Sowell, constrained versus unconstrained, or tragic versus vision of the anointed, does make the case that a lot of people on the left do have this tendency, although it's not in rejecting the existence of an underlying reality usually, so much as insisting that it is malleable, that the map can reshape the territory, which it can, but I think they overstate it. And so I think that to the extent, because I'm someone, I believe in the constrained vision as Sowell describes it, but I don't think I could ever be right-wing, which I might have a video about at some point, probably a blog post, certainly, at some point, because of certain assumptions I see on the right that I'm still trying to pin down as sort of hyper-constrained. And one way I put it is, so the people on the right will tend to be like, you can't do this thing that people did 5 minutes ago, 10 yards over there. You can't do it here and now. And people on the left will be like, hey, if you can imagine it, we can do it. And I think both of these are wrong. And I think this does reflect something beyond like a simple, relatively modern political division, because this person was saying left-right isn't even real. It's something you see from people on the right a lot is left-right really comes out of the French Revolution. I'm beyond it because I'm beyond the Enlightenment, they'll say. And so I was thinking about that, and I think you do have tendencies in one direction or the other that make people lean more towards these visions that we associate with political left and right. But you also see, spiral dynamics kind of explains tendencies towards that too, especially for people who are more flexible. And so until recently, and until I actually started grasping at coral, I always sympathized at least to some degree with the left, which could be my personality, could also be my upbringing, probably some of both. I don't know which is more. But, I've still gone through all of these levels while also holding to the constrained vision, the tragic vision. And so I've been thinking about this in terms of the map territory, and this was my first draft, so I'm not sure I got all of these quite right. So here I put, so everything up to orange can include, and up to blue it must include, that the map is the territory, which I think is I think purple and beige generally there's not really even a recognition of a distinction between map and territory. And then blue and red tend to see, well, basically, if it works to represent the territory well enough, it must actually represent the territory well, and it doesn't have flaws, and there's one map we can follow. And then orange also tends to say there's one map we can follow. So the boundary between conventional and post-conventional morality tends to go through orange. So people in orange start out with conventional and go to post-conventional morality. And people in orange will also tend to sort of understand that the map reflects the territory, but they'll still think there's one map that sort of reflects the territory best. And you can see that in green. You can also see people in green. I put territory does not exist, which again, I think is not quite right. I think some people do believe that, but it's more common to believe that the territory can be defined by the maps, which is something you see with both orange and green to some degree. And then getting above, so once you get to the second order thinking about these questions, then you realize the map reflects the territory, or it reflects rather aspects of the territory, which gets back to what I said at the beginning, that the map is not the territory. Not all maps represent the same territory, much less in the same way, but the territory exists, and finding the right map is useful for navigating the territory. And one thing that I think might distinguish these higher levels, assuming I am grasping at coral, which I really starting to think I am, and my friend who's seen people she thinks is coral kind of thinks too, is that I think coral recognizes this distinction that Searle talks about between physical reality and social reality. And so anyways, I wanted to talk about this. I'll see how this video does. I can always redo it if it doesn't do well. Although, at least 2 videos where they've actually done surprisingly well. So we'll see. But anyways, thanks for watching. I'm Magpie. If you want to support me, I have affiliate links and a Ko-Fi, which has a Discord tier down below. And anyways, thanks again for watching, and I'll see y'all in the next one, which will probably be, unless this one is doing really well and I'll put it off, it'll be Wednesday. That is my 1-year channel anniversary for doing videos. And yeah, so I'll probably see you Wednesday unless this is doing really well, when I'll hold that off a bit. Anyways, thanks again for watching. See y'all in the next one.